My adopted son found out his biological parents were millionaires, and suddenly he told me to get out of. The day my adopted son told me to leave my own house began like any other Tuesday. I woke before sunrise, brewed coffee in the same old kitchen where I had packed thousands of school lunches over the years, and watched the rain slide down the window. At 64, life had become quiet. My wife, Helen, had passed away 3 years earlier after a long battle with cancer. Since then, the silence in our home had become my constant companion. But every empty room still held memories, especially the room at the end of the hallway. The nursery, the room where my son, Ethan, had slept the first night I brought him home. He wasn't my biological child. He was adopted, and I had never regretted that decision for even 1 second. 35 years earlier, I still remembered walking into the adoption agency. The counselor placed a tiny baby into my arms. "He doesn't have anyone," she whispered. The little boy wrapped his tiny fingers around mine. That was it. I was his father, not because we shared blood, because from that moment, we shared everything else. I named him Ethan. Helen cried all the way home. "We're finally parents," she kept saying. Those were the happiest tears I'd ever seen. Money was always tight. I worked construction. Helen taught elementary school. We weren't rich, not even close, but Ethan never went hungry. Never missed a birthday. Never skipped Christmas. Sometimes Helen and I wore old clothes so Ethan could have new ones. Sometimes we skipped vacations to pay for piano lessons. When he wanted to play baseball, I worked weekends to buy him equipment. When he dreamed of college, I took out another mortgage. I never complained. That's what fathers do. People often asked whether I planned to tell Ethan he was adopted. Helen always answered the same way. When he's old enough. When Ethan turned 15, we sat him down. He stared at us quietly after hearing the truth. Then he smiled. "So, you chose me." Helen nodded through tears. "Yes." He hugged us both. "Then I'm the luckiest kid alive." For years, I believed those words. Ethan grew into a smart young man. He graduated with honors, started a successful marketing career, married a beautiful woman named Vanessa. Eventually they had a daughter, little Sophie. The first time Sophie called me grandpa, I nearly cried. Life felt complete. Then everything changed. It started with a phone call. One ordinary Thursday afternoon, Ethan sounded nervous. "Dad, I found someone." "Who?" "My biological family." I froze. For several seconds I couldn't answer. Finally I smiled. "That's wonderful." And I meant it. Every adopted child deserves answers. Every child deserves to know where they came from. I never wanted to stand in his way. He flew to California the following week. When he returned, he seemed different. Distracted. Quieter. He smiled less. Visited less. Answered texts hours later. At first I assumed he was processing complicated emotions. I gave him space. Maybe too much. A month later he invited me to dinner. Vanessa greeted me politely, but something felt strange, almost rehearsed. Ethan barely looked me in the eyes. Halfway through dinner he cleared his throat. "Dad, there's something you should know." I nodded. "My biological parents." He paused. "They're alive." "I know. They've been searching for me for years." "I'm glad." Then came the sentence that changed everything. "They're worth over $50 million. The room went silent. I smiled. Well, good for them. But Ethan didn't smile back. Over the following weeks, expensive watches appeared on his wrist. Luxury cars appeared in his driveway. Designer suits replaced the jeans he'd always worn. He quit his job. "They want me involved in the family business." I congratulated him. Inside, however, I couldn't explain why my heart felt heavy. One afternoon Sophie called me. "Grandpa, are you coming Sunday?" "Of course." She giggled. "I missed you." Those words made my entire week. Sunday arrived. I carried homemade cookies, Sophie's favorite. But when I rang the bell, Vanessa stepped outside instead of inviting me in. She looked uncomfortable. "Ethan wants to talk." My stomach tightened. He walked onto the porch wearing clothes that probably cost more than my monthly pension. His expression was cold, almost unfamiliar. "We need to discuss the house." "What house?" "Yours." "My house." He crossed his arms. "It's too big for one person." I laughed softly. "I suppose our family needs it more." I frowned. "What are you talking about?" He looked me straight in the eyes. "I think it's time you move out." I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. "This house has been in our family for 38 years. You'll manage." "Ethan, my biological parents think it's unhealthy that I'm still emotionally tied to my old life." "Old life?" The words hit harder than any punch I'd ever taken. "So, I'm your old life." He didn't answer. Instead, he handed me a folder. Inside were printed listings for retirement apartments. "I've already found some nice places." My hands trembled. For 35 years, I had kissed scraped knees, helped with homework, stayed awake during fevers, worked overtime, missed birthdays with friends, sold my motorcycle, refinanced my house, buried my wife, and never once regretted choosing him. Now, my son couldn't even call me dad with warmth in his voice. I quietly closed the folder. Then I looked toward the living room window. Little Sophie stood behind the curtain, watching us. Confused, I forced a smile and waved. She waved back. Then Vanessa quickly closed the curtain, as if she didn't want her daughter seeing me. "I'll think about it," I finally said. Ethan nodded. "I think that's best." As I walked toward my old pickup truck, he didn't stop me. He didn't hug me. He didn't even say goodbye. Driving home that evening, the road blurred through my tears. But I made myself one promise. If my son believed money could erase 35 years of love, he was about to learn a lesson no millionaire could buy. I barely slept that night. The folder Ethan had given me sat on my kitchen table. Retirement apartments. Each page felt like a message that read, "Your time in my life is over." I picked up the framed family photo beside the folder. It showed Helen, Ethan, and me standing in front of our house on the day Ethan graduated from college. Helen had her arm around him. I had tears in my eyes. Back then, Ethan had looked at me with pride. Now he looked at me with pity. Or worse, embarrassment. The next morning, my phone rang. It was my lawyer. Not because I had called him. Because years earlier, Helen and I had updated our estate plan after her cancer diagnosis. "My office is reviewing some documents," he said. "I thought you should know that someone contacted us yesterday asking about ownership of your house." I frowned. "Who?" "I'm not allowed to say. But I can tell you this. The caller seemed to believe your son already had rights to the property." I nearly laughed. "He doesn't." The lawyer became serious. "That's exactly why I called." That afternoon, I drove past Ethan's new neighborhood. Luxury homes stretched for blocks. Imported cars lined the driveways. As I slowed near his house, I noticed moving trucks. Furniture worth tens of thousands of dollars. Marble statues. Luxury landscaping. His biological parents were clearly sparing no expense. For a moment, I wondered if they had ever imagined the son they had lost. Did they think money could make up for 35 missing years? A few days later, I received an invitation. A family celebration, hosted by Ethan's biological parents. I almost threw it away. Instead, I decided to go, not to argue, not to beg, simply to congratulate them. After all, they had found their son. Their mansion looked more like a luxury resort than a home. Valets parked cars. Servers carried silver trays. A fountain stood taller than my house. As I stepped inside, conversation slowed. People looked at my old jacket, my worn shoes. I suddenly felt very small. Then a woman approached me. Elegant, expensive jewelry, perfect smile. "You must be Richard." I nodded. "I'm Claire, Ethan's biological mother." She shook my hand. "Thank you for raising our son." Her words sounded polite, but distant, almost professional, as if she were thanking someone for watching her luggage. Her husband, Charles, soon joined us. Tall, confident, used to getting everything he wanted. "I understand you adopted Ethan." I did. He smiled. "We appreciate what you did." Then he added something that made my stomach turn. "Now it's our turn to give him the life he truly deserves." Life he truly deserves. I looked around the mansion. Then quietly replied, "He already had a life." Dinner began. More than 40 guests filled the ballroom. Business leaders, politicians, celebrities. Halfway through the evening, Charles stood to make a toast. To family, everyone raised their glasses. He smiled proudly. "Our son has finally come home." Applause filled the room. Then Ethan stood beside him. "I've spent months discovering where I truly belong." More applause. "I've realized blood is something you can't replace." My heart sank. Not one word about the parents who had spent 35 years loving him. Not one mention of Helen. Nothing. As dessert was served, little Sophie quietly slipped away from the table. She found me standing alone near the garden. "Grandpa." She hugged me tightly. "I missed you." I smiled through tears. "I missed you too." She looked up at me. "Why don't you come over anymore?" Before I could answer, Vanessa hurried outside. "Sophie." Her voice was sharp. "We're leaving. But I'm talking to Grandpa." Vanessa gently pulled her away. We've talked about this. Sophie looked confused. I watched them disappear into the house. My chest felt empty. A week later, someone knocked on my front door. It wasn't Ethan. It was a real estate agent. I'm here to evaluate the property. I stared at him. I think you've got the wrong address. He checked his paperwork. No, sir. The homeowner's son requested a market valuation. I felt the blood drain from my face. My son doesn't own this house. The agent apologized repeatedly before leaving. But the message was clear. Someone had already decided my future. Without asking me, that evening, I finally opened Helen's old cedar chest. Inside were dozens of photo albums, handmade birthday cards, Father's Day drawings, and one sealed envelope with my name. For Richard, only if Ethan ever forgets what love really means. My hands trembled. Helen had written it years before she died. I slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, one that would change everything. For several minutes, I simply stared at the envelope. Helen's handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, steady, full of warmth. My hands shook as I unfolded the letter. The paper had yellowed with age, but every word felt alive. My dear Richard, if you're reading this, something has gone terribly wrong. I always believed Ethan would grow into a kind man, but life has a way of changing people. If he ever forgets what love truly means, don't hate him. Remember, no child is born ungrateful. Sometimes people lose themselves while chasing things that don't last. If that day ever comes, don't beg him to stay. Stand tall. The truth always finds its way home. By the time I reached the last line, tears blurred the page. Helen had known, not exactly what would happen, but she had known life could test even the strongest family. The next morning, I visited our family lawyer, Michael Lawson. He welcomed me into his office with a worried expression. I've been expecting you. I handed him Helen's letter. He read it quietly before placing it back on the desk. She was an extraordinary woman. She always was. He nodded. Richard, there's something else you need to know. I looked up. When you and Helen updated your wills years ago, she insisted on adding a special clause. What clause? If Ethan ever tried to force you out of your home or showed financial coercion, he would immediately lose every inheritance you planned to leave him. I blinked. I forgot we even discussed that. Michael opened a thick file. You also created a charitable trust. I frowned. I did. He smiled gently. Helen wanted your estate to help children waiting for adoption if Ethan abandoned his responsibilities toward you. I sat in complete silence. Everything Helen had prepared years ago was now becoming real. 3 days later, Ethan called. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. Dad, can we meet? Of course. Tomorrow. I'll be there. For a brief moment, hope returned. Maybe he wanted to apologize. Maybe he had realized what he'd done. Maybe. We met at a downtown cafe. He arrived wearing another expensive suit. A luxury watch sparkled beneath his sleeve. He smiled politely. How have you been? I've had better weeks. He laughed awkwardly. Then he slid another folder across the table. I've already found a buyer for your house. I stared at him. You what? They're offering well above market value. Ethan, you'll never have to worry about money again. I never asked for money. He sighed impatiently. Dad, please don't make this emotional. Those words hurt more than anything else he'd said. 35 years of memories. Reduced to a real estate transaction. I slowly pushed the folder back toward him. I'm not selling. His smile disappeared. You don't have a choice forever. I do. You'll understand eventually. No. I looked him directly in the eyes. I understand perfectly. He frowned. What does that mean? It means the son I raised would never have spoken to me like this. For the first time, he looked uncomfortable, but instead of apologizing, he stood up and walked away. That evening, someone unexpected knocked on my front door. When I opened it, Claire stood there, alone, without security, without expensive clothes, without makeup. She looked human. May I come in? I hesitated, then stepped aside. She slowly looked around the house. Family photographs covered every wall. Ethan's kindergarten picture, his baseball trophies, college graduation, Christmas mornings, birthdays, vacations. Every corner of the home told one story. A father who had loved his son completely. Claire stopped in front of one photograph. It showed Helen holding 6-year-old Ethan after his first bicycle ride. Tears filled her eyes. I missed all of this. I remained silent. She whispered, I thought money could fix losing him. It can't. She nodded slowly. I know that now. She confessed something I never expected. Charles has been pushing Ethan. What do you mean? He believes Ethan should completely separate from his old life. My jaw tightened. He says it's better for the family's image. So this wasn't entirely Ethan's idea. She lowered her head. No, that answer didn't excuse Ethan. But it explained something. Someone had been feeding his pride, encouraging his worst instincts. Before leaving, Claire quietly said, "I'm sorry." For the first time, her apology felt genuine. 2 nights later, my phone rang at nearly midnight. It was Sophie. She was crying. "Grandpa, I'm scared." "What happened?" "Mom and Dad are yelling." I immediately grabbed my keys. As I drove toward Ethan's mansion, I had no idea that by sunrise, everything would change forever. I reached Ethan's mansion in less than 20 minutes. The front door was wide open. 2 expensive cars sat crooked in the driveway, their engines still running. Inside, shouting echoed through the marble halls. Servants stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene. As I stepped into the living room, I saw Ethan and Charles arguing face to face. "You lied to me," Ethan shouted. Charles's face turned red. "I gave you everything." "No," Ethan replied. "You gave me money." "That's not the same thing." Claire stood nearby, tears streaming down her face, while Vanessa held Sophie close. When Ethan noticed me, the room fell silent. "Dad," he whispered. It was the first time in months he had called me that without hesitation. Charles turned toward me. "This is a family matter." I answered calmly. "It has always been a family matter." Charles slammed a folder onto the table. Inside were legal documents. "I've decided to change my will," he said coldly. "Ethan won't inherit the company unless he follows my instructions." "What instructions?" I asked. Charles looked directly at Ethan. "He cuts all ties with his adoptive father." The room froze. Claire gasped. Vanessa stared at her husband. Sophie clutched Ethan's hand. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Ethan slowly closed the folder. "No." Charles frowned. "What did you say?" I said no. "You'd throw away hundreds of millions." Ethan nodded. "If that's the price of losing the man who raised me, it's too expensive." Charles laughed bitterly. "You'll regret this." "Maybe. But I already regret hurting my father." He walked across the room until he stood in front of me. His eyes were filled with tears. "I'm sorry, Dad. I was blinded by money. I forgot who stayed awake when I had pneumonia. I forgot who taught me to ride a bike. I forgot who paid for college. I forgot who held Mom's hand until her last breath." He broke down crying. "I'm so ashamed." For a long moment, I simply looked at him. The pain he'd caused couldn't disappear overnight. But I also saw something I hadn't seen in months. The son I had raised. "I can't erase what happened," Ethan said. "I know. But I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." I slowly placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then start today." Without another word, he hugged me. The same way he had hugged me when he was 15 and learned he was adopted. Only this time, he held on even tighter. Charles picked up his briefcase. "If you walk away now, don't ever come back." Claire stepped beside Ethan. "He won't be walking away alone." Charles stared at her. "You'd leave too." She nodded. "I already lost my son once. I'm not losing him again." Charles looked around the room. No one followed him. For the first time in his life, money couldn't buy loyalty. He walked out alone. A week later, Ethan stood beside me in my front yard. "I'm not selling this house," I said. He smiled. "I know. And I don't want you buying me another one." "I know. I only want one thing." "What?" He looked down. "A second chance." I thought about Helen. About her letter. About everything we'd survived. Then I smiled. "You already have one." Over the following months, Ethan changed. He sold the luxury sports car. Returned to work on his own merits instead of relying on family wealth. Every Sunday, he, Vanessa, and Sophie came to my house for dinner. Not because they felt obligated. Because they wanted to. The house was filled with laughter again. One afternoon, Sophie climbed onto my lap. "Grandpa." "Yes, sweetheart, who are my real grandparents?" I smiled. "You have 2 families. But being a real family isn't about blood. It's about who loves you every single day." She grinned. "Then you're my real grandpa." I hugged her tightly. "So are you my real granddaughter." She laughed. "Always." Months later, Claire visited my home again. This time she brought no gifts. No expensive wine. No jewelry. Only a photo album. "I thought we could share memories," she said softly. For hours, we looked through old pictures together. She showed me Ethan's first photograph at the hospital. I showed her his first day of kindergarten. She cried over the years she had missed. I cried remembering Helen. By sunset, We both understood something. Neither of us had replaced the other. We had simply loved the same boy in different chapters of his life. A year later, Ethan organized a family gathering. Friends, neighbors, and relatives filled the backyard. Before dinner, he tapped a glass to get everyone's attention. I want to say something. The yard became quiet. I spent months believing money could tell me who my family was. He looked toward me. I was wrong. He walked over and handed me a small wooden box. Inside was a silver plaque engraved with words that brought tears to my eyes. To the man who proved that being a father is a choice made every day, not a gift of blood. Thank you for choosing me. There wasn't a dry eye in the yard. I looked up at the sky and whispered, "We did it, Helen." The wind gently rustled the trees, and for a brief moment, it felt as though she was smiling with us. 6 months passed, and life slowly settled into a rhythm that felt familiar again. Every Sunday, Ethan, Vanessa, Sophie, and Claire gathered at my old house. The dining table that had once seemed far too large for one lonely man was now filled with laughter, stories, and the smell of Helen's favorite recipes. Vanessa had learned to cook from Helen's old notebook, and every meal felt like a small tribute to the woman who had held our family together for so many years. One evening, Ethan stood quietly in the garage, staring at the old red bicycle I had bought him when he was 7. "Dad," he said softly, "do you remember this?" I smiled. "You refused to let me take the training wheels off." He laughed through tears. I was terrified. "And then you crashed into Mrs. Parker's mailbox." We both laughed. "I thought you'd be angry." "I was just happy you got back up." Ethan lowered his head. "I wish I'd gotten back up sooner after making the biggest mistake of my life." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "The important thing is that you did." A few weeks later, Sophie came running into the house carrying a folded piece of paper. Grandpa, I won first place." "For what?" "My school essay." She unfolded the paper and began reading aloud. "My hero. Most people think heroes wear capes or become famous. My hero wears old boots, tells funny jokes, and makes the best chocolate chip cookies. He adopted my daddy when nobody else could. He taught him kindness, honesty, and love. My grandpa says family is built with your heart, not your blood. That's why he's my hero." When she finished, the room was silent. Claire wiped away tears. Vanessa hugged Sophie. Ethan couldn't even speak. I simply wrapped my granddaughter in my arms. Not long afterward, Ethan organized a charity dinner to raise money for children waiting to be adopted. More than 200 people attended. Business owners, teachers, neighbors, families who had adopted children. Near the end of the evening, Ethan stepped onto the stage. "I owe someone an apology," he said into the microphone. The room became completely silent. For months, I believed money made people important. He looked toward me, sitting quietly at the back of the room. I was wrong. My father worked overtime so I could go to college. He skipped vacations so I could play baseball. He stayed beside my mother every day until she took her last breath. And after everything he sacrificed, I repaid him with betrayal. His voice cracked. "I will regret that for the rest of my life." Then he walked down from the stage. In front of everyone, he knelt beside my chair. "I'm sorry, Dad." The audience watched in silence. I helped him to his feet. "You don't have to kneel. You just have to keep becoming the man your mother believed you were." The crowd erupted into applause. Many people were openly crying. Months later, there was another unexpected knock at my front door. When I opened it, Charles stood there. He looked years older. Gone was the expensive confidence. His shoulders were slumped. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said quietly. "I only wanted to say, I was wrong." He admitted that he had spent his entire life believing wealth solved every problem. But when Claire left him, when Ethan chose love over inheritance, when even his closest business partners abandoned him after his retirement, he finally understood something. "Money bought me houses," he whispered. "It never bought me a family." I nodded slowly. "I hope you find peace." He thanked me and quietly walked away. It was the last time I ever saw him. On the anniversary of Helen's passing, our entire family visited the cemetery together. Ethan placed white roses beside her headstone. Claire added a single lily. Sophie carefully laid down a handwritten note. It read, "Thank you for choosing my daddy. Because you chose him, I got the best grandpa in the world." The wind gently moved through the trees. No one spoke for several minutes. Then Ethan looked at the sky. "I hope you're proud of me now, Mom." I smiled. "I think she always loved you." We stood together in peaceful silence. 3 generations. One family, not connected by blood alone, but by forgiveness, sacrifice, and unconditional love. As we walked back toward our cars, Sophie slipped her tiny hand into mine. Grandpa, yes, we'll always stay together, right? I squeezed her hand gently. As long as love lives in this family, we'll never be apart. And for the first time in a very long time, I knew that was true. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, I stood on my porch watching Ethan, Vanessa, Sophie, and Claire laugh together in the front yard. Years ago, I believed I had lost my son forever. For a while, money had blinded him, pride had changed him, and strangers had convinced him that blood mattered more than love. But life has a way of revealing what truly matters. Millionaires can buy mansions, they can buy luxury cars, they can even buy influence. But they can never buy the memories of a father who stayed awake through sleepless nights, celebrated every victory, comforted every failure, and loved a child without expecting anything in return. As I looked at the family gathered before me, I realized something Helen had always known. Family is never defined by DNA. It is defined by the people who choose each other every single day. Ethan finally understood that the greatest inheritance he had ever received wasn't money. It was unconditional love, and no fortune in the world could ever replace that. The moving truck never came. The "for sale" sign was never placed in the yard. Instead, every Sunday, the old porch filled with laughter again. Children played in the garden where Ethan had once learned to throw a baseball. The kitchen echoed with stories, homemade dinners, and the kind of warmth no amount of money could ever purchase. One evening, Ethan stood beside me on the porch as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the trees. "Dad," he said quietly, "if I could erase everything I did, I would." I smiled gently. "We can't change yesterday." He nodded. "But we can honor it by living differently tomorrow." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Sophie ran outside and grabbed both of our hands. "Come on," she laughed. "Dinner's getting cold." Ethan looked at me and smiled, the same genuine smile I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. As we walked toward the house together, I glanced at Helen's favorite rocking chair. It swayed gently in the evening breeze. For just a second, I could almost imagine her sitting there, smiling at the family she had helped build. I whispered softly, "We kept our promise, Helen. Love won." Sometimes life teaches us that blood may create a family tree, but love is what keeps its roots alive. Because in the end, the richest people are not the ones with the biggest bank accounts. They're the ones who never have to wonder who truly loves them. Nearly a year had passed since the day Ethan chose family over fortune. The wounds had begun to heal, not because they had been forgotten, but because every day, Ethan worked to earn back the trust he had broken. He never missed a Sunday dinner. He called every morning just to ask how I was doing. Sometimes we talked for 5 minutes. Sometimes for an hour. Neither of us ever took those conversations for granted. One rainy afternoon, Ethan arrived unexpectedly. He wasn't smiling. "Dad, can we talk?" "Of course." He placed a thick envelope on the kitchen table. "I received this today." Inside was a legal notice. Charles had passed away. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. "I didn't expect this," Ethan whispered. I rested a hand on his shoulder. "No matter what happened, losing a parent is never easy." He nodded slowly. A week later, Charles's attorney called the family together for the reading of his final will. The room was filled with lawyers, executives, and distant relatives. Everyone expected a fight over millions. Instead, the attorney quietly unfolded the document. "I am carrying out the final wishes of Charles Whitmore." The room fell silent. "To my son, Ethan." Ethan looked down. "I leave neither my company nor my fortune." Whispers spread across the room. "But I leave something I never gave him while I was alive." The attorney paused. "My apology." Claire covered her mouth with both hands. The attorney continued reading. "I spent my life believing success was measured by wealth. I was wrong. If Richard, the man who raised you, is present when this letter is read, I ask him to accept my deepest apology. He succeeded where I failed. He raised a good man. I only taught him how to become a rich one." The room became completely silent. Even the executives lowered their eyes. Charles had donated most of his fortune to children's hospitals, adoption organizations, and scholarships for orphan children. Only a small portion remained for the family. As the meeting ended, Claire quietly turned to me. "He finally understood." I nodded. "I wish he'd learned it sooner." "So do I." That evening, Ethan and I drove home together. He looked out the window for several miles before speaking. Dad, yes, if you had the chance to adopt me all over again, knowing everything that happened, would you still choose me? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I smiled. In a heartbeat, he looked at me with tears in his eyes. Even after everything, being a father isn't loving someone only when they make you proud. It's loving them enough to help them find their way back when they lose themselves. Ethan quietly wiped away his tears. For the first time in years, he looked completely at peace. Charles's funeral was simple. There were no television cameras, no business reporters, no extravagant floral displays stretching across the chapel. Only a handful of relatives, a few lifelong employees, and the family he had nearly lost forever. Claire stood quietly beside Ethan, holding his hand. I remained near the back of the chapel. This wasn't my place to lead. It was my place to support. After the service, an elderly man slowly approached me. "My name is Walter," he said. "I worked with Charles for over 30 years. He smiled sadly. "He spoke about you during the last weeks of his life." I looked surprised. "He did?" Walter nodded. "He said there was only one man he had ever considered better than himself." "Who?" Walter's eyes met mine. "You." I shook my head. "I don't think that's true." Walter smiled. "He said you measured success by love. He measured it by money. And in the end, he admitted you had won." A month later, Ethan invited me to visit the old adoption agency where my journey as a father had begun. The building had been renovated, but the waiting room looked strangely familiar. The director welcomed us warmly. She recognized my name immediately. "You adopted Ethan 36 years ago." I smiled. I never imagined anyone would remember. She opened a dusty archive and carefully placed an old photograph on the table. There I was, 36 years younger, holding a tiny baby wrapped in a blue blanket. My eyes filled with tears. Ethan stared at the picture for a long time. "I've never seen this before." I handed him the photo. "You were only 3 weeks old," he whispered. "You looked so happy." I was. The director smiled gently. "We've always told new adoptive parents your story." I blinked. "My story?" She nodded. "They needed hope. They needed proof that love can build a family." I couldn't speak. Before leaving, Ethan quietly walked over to the donation office. "I'd like to establish a scholarship." The director looked surprised. "What kind?" "For families who want to adopt but can't afford the legal costs." She covered her mouth. "That's incredibly generous." Ethan smiled. "I wouldn't exist as a son without adoption. I want another child to have the same chance I had." For the first time in many years, I felt Helen's dream living on through him. That evening, as we drove home, Ethan looked out the window. "Dad, yes, I finally understand something." "What is it?" "My biological parents gave me life." He turned toward me. "But you taught me how to live." Those words were worth more than every dollar Charles had ever earned. I smiled. "And you've finally remembered who you are." He nodded. "I'll never forget again." As the sun disappeared behind the hills, I realized that forgiveness had not erased the past. It had transformed it into something stronger. The house was no longer just a place where memories lived. It had become a home where love had survived its greatest test. The seasons changed. Spring flowers replaced the winter frost, and for the first time in years, I looked forward to each new morning. Life had become peaceful again. Not perfect, but peaceful. Every Sunday, our family gathered at the old house. Sophie's laughter echoed through the backyard. Vanessa baked Helen's famous apple pie. Claire often arrived early just to help set the table. Sometimes I would quietly sit on the porch and watch everyone. It reminded me of the life Helen and I had dreamed about. One afternoon, Ethan pulled into the driveway with a nervous smile. "Dad, I need your advice." "About what?" He handed me a set of blueprints. At the top of the page were the words, "The Helen Carter Family Center." I looked at him in surprise. "What's this?" "I've decided to build a community center." "For whom?" "For adoptive families." He smiled. "There'll be counseling, legal guidance, parenting classes, and scholarships for children who need homes." I felt my throat tighten. "You named it after your mother." There wasn't another name that even came close. Construction began a few months later. The whole town seemed excited. Volunteers arrived every weekend. Local businesses donated supplies. Former foster children offered to help. By the time the building was finished, hundreds of people had contributed. On opening day, families lined up outside the entrance. Some were hoping to adopt. Others had already adopted children and wanted support. The ribbon stretched across the front doors. Ethan handed me the scissors. "No," I said, "you should do it." He smiled. I wouldn't even be standing here without you. Together, we cut the ribbon. The crowd erupted into applause. Inside the lobby stood a bronze plaque. It read, "Dedicated to Helen and Richard Carter, whose love proved that family is built through commitment, sacrifice, and kindness, not biology." I stood silently in front of it. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Claire gently squeezed my hand. "Helen would have loved this." I nodded. "She already does." Later that afternoon, a young couple approached me. The woman held a tiny baby wrapped in a white blanket. "We wanted to thank you," she said. I looked confused. "For what?" "We almost gave up on adoption because we couldn't afford the legal process. The scholarship from this center made it possible." She smiled through tears. "Today we became parents." She carefully placed the baby in my arms. As I looked into those tiny eyes, I remembered the day I first held Ethan. The same tiny fingers, the same innocent face, the same feeling that my life had changed forever. I smiled. Another family had begun. That evening, Ethan stood beside me outside the center. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think my greatest gift was discovering where I came from." He looked at the families walking through the doors. "But now I know. My greatest gift was the man who never stopped calling me his son." I smiled. "And you'll always be my son." He hugged me tightly. This time, there were no misunderstandings. No pride. No money standing between us. Only love. As the sun set behind the new community center, I looked up at the sky and whispered, "We kept our promise, Helen. Your love will live on in every family that walks through these doors." And in that moment, I realized something simple but true. 5 years passed. The Helen Carter Family Center had become one of the most respected adoption support organizations in the state. Every month, dozens of children found loving homes. Every success story reminded me of the day I first carried Ethan through my front door. One bright Saturday morning, the center celebrated its 5th anniversary. Families filled the courtyard. Children laughed as balloons floated into the blue sky. Some parents had adopted only weeks earlier. Others had been raising their children for years. Each family had a different story. But every story began with the same choice, love. Ethan walked onto the stage and looked at the crowd. "I used to believe my life changed the day I found my biological parents," he began. He paused and smiled toward me. "I was wrong. My life really changed the day one ordinary man chose to become my father." The audience applauded. He continued, "Today, I want every adopted child here to know something. You never need to wonder whether you're loved enough. If someone chooses you every single day, that love is stronger than anything written on a birth certificate." Many parents wiped away tears. The host then announced a surprise. "This year's Lifetime Family Award goes to..." I looked around, curious. "Richard Carter." The room erupted into applause. I slowly walked to the stage. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Finally, I looked at the families gathered before me. "I never set out to receive awards," I said. "I simply wanted to be the father one little boy deserved. If I've learned anything, it's this. Children don't remember the price of the gifts you buy them. They remember who stayed. They remember who listened. They remember who loved them when life became difficult. And that's what makes a parent." The audience stood for a long ovation. Later that evening, Sophie, now a teenager, walked beside me through the center's garden. "Grandpa," she said, "I've decided what I want to do after college." "What?" "I want to become a family counselor. So I can help children who feel alone." I smiled proudly. "Your grandmother would be so proud of you." She looked toward the bronze plaque dedicated to Helen. "I hope one day someone says I changed lives the way you and Grandma did." "You already have," I replied. "You just don't know it yet." As the celebration ended, Ethan handed me a small wooden box. Inside was the original adoption certificate. Next to it was a new framed document. It officially declared the family center's main library would forever be known as the Richard and Helen Carter Legacy Hall. Beneath the title were simple words. "Love makes a family." I couldn't hold back my tears. Ethan smiled. "You spent your whole life giving me a name. Now it's my turn to make sure yours is never forgotten." I hugged him tightly. "No matter where life takes us, you'll always be my son. And you'll always be my dad." The sun slowly disappeared beyond the trees as our family stood together, stronger than ever. At that moment, I realized the greatest inheritance I would ever leave behind wasn't a house, a bank account, or a family name. It was a legacy of unconditional love. Because in the end, the richest hearts belong to the people who choose love over pride, forgiveness over anger, and family over fortune.